Have you ever felt like the darkness could swallow you up? What if you suddenly realized that you were no longer alone on the road? Get ready for a chilling experience. In this video, we'll explore a story that will challenge your perception of reality and leave you wondering, what do we really see in the darkness? If you're ready to face your fears, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't miss what's coming next.
Lonely roads had always been a dangerous territory who ventured out at night, and truck drivers, accustomed to the isolation of highway, knew this better than any. The headlights of their trucks illuminated the emptiness of the road, but they also brought to the surface a feeling that something else was watching, something that went beyond the simple fear of the dark. There was a legend that circulated at rest stops, a story told in whispers, about truck drivers who never returned home after taking unknown routes. It was said that on some nights, the silence was broken by strange sounds coming from afar, as if the roads, no matter how vast they were, had a will of them. Those who dared to get lost or take a detour in search of shortcuts ended up finding more than they had bargained for. It wasn't just the heavy atmosphere of the early morning or the lack of cell phone signal, but something deeper, a void, an abyss that swallowed both the roads and the people. What happened to these truck drivers was unknown, but the reports were always the same. They disappeared without a trace. The stories said that if someone followed these missing truck drivers, they too would get lost, trapped in an endless route, as if the road itself were alive, deciding who deserved to pass and who did not. Some said that the road was marked by something beyond, an invisible force that only revealed itself when someone else dared to enter its depths. Others spoke of strange apparitions, shadows crossing the road without explanation, and the sound of a distant engine that never arrived, but seemed to draw nearer with each kilometer traveled. The fear of the unknown had never been so tangible. For the truck drivers, the road was not just a profession, it was a silent battle against the invisible, and they knew that, at any moment, they could be the next to disappear. It was a dark, cold night with thick fog when João, an experienced truck driver, received the urgent mission of transporting a load of. The road was empty, and the constant sound of the truck's engine filled the silence. His route took him down secondary roads, the ones few dared to take. They were winding paths, with little traffic, but he knew them like the back of his hand. He had driven this route countless times, and despite the eerie atmosphere, he didn't hesitate to continue. After all, a good truck driver wasn't afraid of the road. However, on that night, something felt different. The air was heavier, as if the fog had the power to swallow everything around, distorting reality. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, but the light seemed fragile against the thick curtain of fog. João squinted, trying to see beyond, but all he could make out was the road ahead, which seemed to stretch on endlessly. The radio was silent, as if the device itself had succumbed to the oppressive silence of the night. He tried tuning into another station, but there was no signal. The sense of unease grew inside him. The streets were deserted, and although he knew the route well, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw something moving between the trees. But when he looked directly, there was nothing. Time seemed to stand still, as if the road's clock had stopped for. It was then, as he passed a sharp curve, that something made him brake suddenly. A figure appeared in the middle of the road, standing still, motionless. João startled, his heart racing, and slammed his foot on the brake. The figure seemed human, but the shadow surrounding it made it indescribable. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, the figure had disappeared into the darkness. His body froze. He knew something was wrong. Forcing himself to ignore the chill running up his spine, João accelerated the truck and continued. But with each kilometer, the weight in the air seemed to intensify. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that perhaps the exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But as the fog grew thicker and the road narrower, he felt that this night held something he wasn't prepared to face, something that perhaps wasn't just the road he knew so well. As he drove, something began to unsettle João. The air inside the cabin felt denser, and a strange sensation took hold of his chest, as if he were being watched. With every curve of the road, he felt something following him in the shadows, a silent presence that was approaching without making a sound. The wind hissed against the truck, and the engine, though steady, seemed to echo louder than usual. He glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, but all he saw was the deep darkness, swallowing up what remained of the road behind him. But as he moved forward, the fog became thicker, almost solid, like a mass that devoured everything around it. João tried to ignore the increasing pressure in his chest and the cold at the back of his neck, but he couldn't. His eyes fixed on a point ahead, and that's when he saw it. On the edge of the road, standing like a shadow blending with the fog, was an old truck. Its paint was chipped, the wheels covered in dirt, and the glow of the taillights almost faded by dust and time. The vehicle seemed to be there for a specific reason, as if it were waiting for something or someone. Zhuang's heart raced. He passed slowly, but his gaze was drawn to the figure near the truck. The man, or whatever it was, stood still, motionless, wearing a hood and a dark cloak that enveloped him completely, making it impossible to distinguish his features. But what disturbed Zhuang the most wasn't the hood or the cloak, but the fixed stare the figure seemed to cast in his direction. It was an empty gaze, but penetrating, as if he were being watched from within a deep darkness. Zhuang tried to identify something in the figure's eyes, but there was no expression, just a faceless, lifeless presence, something that felt unreal. With his heart pounding, Zhuang looked ahead and accelerated, trying to shake the vision of that strange man from his mind. But the feeling of being followed, of being watched, didn't leave. He felt as though the figure's eyes were still on him, as if he had witnessed something he shouldn't have. With each kilometer that passed, he felt the weight of the fog growing heavier and the road growing more desolate. Fear gripped his throat, and he knew that somehow, that road, that night, was about to take him to a place from which he might never return. Not knowing what to do, Zhuang pressed the accelerator hard, trying to keep his mind occupied and push away any thoughts that might increase the fear taking hold of him. He could not fully comprehend it. He kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, that the presence of the hooded truck driver was still following him in the shadows. He no longer wanted to think about that figure, nor what it could represent. It must be exhaustion, he thought, trying to convince himself that it was nothing more than an illusion caused by the loneliness of the road and the dense night. But when he turned the curve, something changed. The truck, the old truck parked at the side of the road, disappeared from his sight. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, also vanished, as if it were a mist dissolved by the wind. The road ahead of him suddenly seemed calmer, less oppressive. The silence, which had once felt heavy with something sinister, became more familiar, almost reassuring. Zhuang exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath, trying to relax his tense muscle. He glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, but the road was empty. There were no more signs of the old truck or anything else that could justify the weight he had felt moments before. The fog remained, but now it seemed farther away, as if it were retreating, leaving the road clear for him forward. It was just in my head, Zhuang thought, trying to laugh at himself, but at the same time, a chill ran down his spine. Something inside him knew that this brief sense of relief didn't mean that the strange presence had truly gone away. Something had changed and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something else waiting at. Even with the truck now out of sight, the road, with its shadows and mystery, still held a secret Zhuang couldn't unravel. As he continued on his way, Zhuang noticed that the road was becoming more and more deserted, lifeless, as if the entire world had vanished, leaving him alone in that dark stretch, enveloped by the thick fog. The weak light from the truck's headlights barely cut through the fog that seemed to swallow everything around him. He tried to stay focused, forcing his eyes to remain fixed on the road, but with each passing kilometer, a growing sense that something was wrong began to intensify, like a weight in the air. With every distant headlight he saw, his breath became heavier. The feeling that he was no longer alone grew with each passing second, as if something or someone was watching him from somewhere beyond his line of sight. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, and he forced his gaze, trying to understand what was happening. Then, as he rounded another curve, he saw the light. At first, he thought it was just another vehicle approaching, but something was wrong. The light didn't seem to come from headlights. It was different, softer, yet at the same time intense. A light that seemed to expand in all directions without a visible source. It floated above the road, illuminating the asphalt in a supernatural way, like an aurora. The fog, which had once been thick and dense, seemed to retreat from the light, almost as if it had a life of its own, pulling back in the face of this strange radiance. Zhuang squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing, but the light didn't fade. It shone with a gentle intensity, but there was something unsettling in the way it felt. Was it leading him? The light remained suspended in the air, unmoving, not dissipating, as if it were a presence of its own, an entity manifesting right there, at that point on the road. Fear overtook his body, but something pushed him to continue, as if the road itself were asking him to move forward. He slowed down, the truck creaking slightly as he tried to keep his eyes fixed on the light. The fog seemed to have dissipated around the road, but the rest of the world remained wrapped in darkness. The light was neither warm nor cold, it was just present. Zhuang felt a shiver run up his spine, as if that light were waiting for his reaction, as if it were testing his courage. With every passing second, the sensation that something was wrong intensified. He knew that light was unnatural. He knew something beyond his comprehension was happening, but he didn't know what. All he knew was that, As much as the light seemed to beckon him, he should not get closer. Yet, his instincts, mixed with a strange curiosity, pushed him forward, as if the fate of his journey were intertwined with that mysterious light. Zhuang tried to swerve, but something stopped him from continuing. It wasn't the steering wheel, nor the fatigue. It was as if the entire road was being shaped by an invisible force, something that infiltrated the asphalt and the truck's wheels. A force pulling him forward, and he couldn't do anything to resist. He looked to the sides, trying to find a way out, a turn, anything that would take him away from that growing light. But there was no alternative. The path ahead was empty, the road seemed endless, and somehow he knew there was no turning back. The light, once soft and distant, now seemed to grow, swallowing everything around it. It expanded in a frightening, as if it were alive, absorbing the fog, the sounds, even the space around it. The truck, no matter how much Zhuang accelerated, didn't seem to move fast enough. He looked in the rearview mirror, but the darkness seemed to have closed in behind him, as if the light was devouring what was behind him and pushing him into the unknown ahead. His hand trembled on the steering wheel, but he couldn't stop. The fear coiled around his chest, but at the same time, a strange force urged him forward, a need to continue, as if the road wanted him, as if something was waiting for him. Every part of his being screamed for him to stop, to give up, but the truck continued, guided by an invisible hand that seemed to control his movements. The light was now so intense that Zhuang had to close his eyes, but even with his eyelids shut he could feel its presence, as if it were penetrating directly into his mind, invading his thoughts, shaping his fears. He tried again to look to the sides, but there was nothing. The road was narrowing, and the light, a light that came from no known source, seemed to fill all the space, as if he were about to be swallowed by it. He accelerated further, unsure if he was fleeing or being drawn in. Everything around him was disappearing. All that remained was the light and the road leading him toward a destination he could not understand. Zhuang felt he was approaching something that transcended anything he had ever experienced. But what was it? Where was it leading him? Where was this road taking him? He had no answers, only the certainty that he could not stop. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the silence. A desperate scream that seemed to come from all directions at once. Zhuang's skin prickled from head to toe, his eyes widened, and his heart raced. The scream was terrifying, as if something or someone were pleading for help, in immeasurable torment. He looked to the side, trying to identify the source of the sound, and that's when he saw it. Floating beside the truck, almost like an apparition, was a disfigured figure. The image was as unbearable as the fog that enveloped them, almost translucent, as if it were between two worlds. The being appeared human, but there was something completely wrong with its form. Its clothes were torn, its body distorted and burned, as if it had been consumed by something unspeakable. Its face, a mask of terror, was frozen in an expression of absolute despair. The eyes, glazed over, stared directly at Zhuang, and he knew, without a doubt, that the creature was begging for something. The figure, with a slow move, pointed to Zhuang's truck. Its gesture was desperate, as if it were asking for help, as if it wanted Zhuang to see it, to recognize, to understand its suffering. Fear tightened Zhuang's chest even more, and he tried to look away, but his eyes were fixed on that vision, as if something was stopping him from turning away. He wanted to scream, wanted to do something, but the words wouldn't come. Fear paralyzed him. But before he could react, as if the fog itself had taken over the scene, the vision disappeared. The figure disintegrated, vanishing as if it were carried away by the wind, as if it had never been there. The feeling that it was still watching him, that the plea for help still hung in the air, made him look around frantically, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the light still surrounded him, and the figure had dissolved into the darkness. Zhuang was stunned, his body shaking uncontrollably. The scream still echoed in his ears, and the image of that creature, with its eyes full of pure terror, wouldn't leave his mind. What had he seen? Was it real? Or was it some kind of hallucination caused by fear, exhaustion, the strangeness of that night? But somehow, he knew it wasn't just in his mind. Something was happening there, on the road. Something that transcended understanding, and he was trapped in it, not knowing how to escape. The truck driver was now completely lost. The road he had known like the back of his hand seemed to have transformed before his eyes. The curves, the markings on the asphalt, everything was distorted. The path he used to take with ease now seemed like an endless maze, as if the streets and landscapes had changed shape, hiding in the shadows of the fog that was growing thicker by the second. He looked at his watch, hoping to find some sign of familiarity, but the marked time seemed distorted. The minute hand moved erratically, as if time itself were being altered, broken, as if the clock had lost its meaning. With his breath quickening and his body tense, Zhuang decided that he needed to stop. Maybe this was some sort of nightmare, something he could control by slowing down, taking a breath. making the fear disappear. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and felt the silence invade the cabin. But as he got out of the truck, something made him freeze. The road behind him, the route he had just traveled, was completely erased by the fog. There were no more traces of the path he had followed, as if the road itself had been swallowed, erased by the darkness. There was no more familiar curve, no more landmarks he knew, nothing. There was only a thick layer of fog, opaque and dense, that hid everything beyond it. He turned around, searching for the distant city lights that should have been visible somewhere, but there was nothing. The darkness seemed absolute, and the light that had once seemed so distant no longer existed. Zhuang tried to stay calm, but his heart was pounding so hard he felt as though his chest might burst. He looked at the truck, trying to convince himself that the road was still there, that he just needed to wait, that this was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But the silence around him wasn't. He couldn't hear anything but his own thoughts, and that only intensified the feeling that he was in a place where time and space had distorted. He took a few steps toward the fog, trying to see what lay ahead, but it was as if the very air had swallowed him up, as if the mist closed in around him, leaving no space to move forward or back. Fear took over. Where was the city? Where were the other roads? He was completely isolated, and the only thing he could see was the fog, like an impenetrable wall. He tried to breathe deeply, but there was not enough air to fill his lungs. The sensation of being trapped in an endless nightmare fully engulfed him. Zhuang knew he was no longer in a familiar place, nor in the time he understood. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he felt that the more he tried to understand, the further he drifted from any answer that made sense. Zhuang didn't know what to do. The feeling of disorientation was total, and the pressure of the fog around him only grew with each passing second. He grabbed his phone, trying to get some signal, anything that could connect him to the world beyond that cursed road. But the screen stayed blank. No signal, no hope. He tried to turn on the truck's radio, but the only response was oppressive static, white noise that filled the air, but offered no words of comfort. Panic began to take hold of him, and his thoughts raced, trying to find an exit, an explanation for everything. What was happening? Where was he? But before he could think of a plan, something shattered the anguished silence of the night. The sound of a distant engine, but growing louder, cut through the stillness. Zhuang turned instinctively, believing it could be another truck, someone else lost on the same road. Maybe someone who could help him, someone who had an answer, some kind of explanation. But as he looked back, Zhuang's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't another truck. It was the same old truck from before, the one he had seen parked on the side of the road. Now, it was right behind him, stopped just a few meters away, as if it had appeared from nowhere, as if it had emerged from the emptiness that stretched behind him. The engine rumbled softly, but somehow, it didn't seem to be moving. The truck's taillights were off, and the only light came from the fog that hovered around, making everything more surreal. And then, he saw her. The hooded figure was there, motionless, like a shadow projected from the cabin of the old truck. There was no sound coming from, not even a movement, just a dark silhouette, a hood covering her head and hiding her face. But the eyes, Zhuang felt he could sense the eyes of the figure even without seeing them. They watched him, cold and penetrating, with a calmness that made his blood freeze. The figure didn't move, didn't say a word. She was just there, watching him, with a presence that seemed endless. Fear swallowed Zhuang, and he desperately tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe it was just another person, a trucker like him, someone who had also gotten lost, someone who was as scared as he was. But when he looked again, he knew that wasn't it. There was something about that, or that thing, that didn't make sense, something that transcended reason. The silence was absolute. Zhuang didn't know what to do, or where to run. The road ahead was blocked by the fog, and the figure behind him seemed like a wall of darkness, a presence that would not allow escape. He felt a weight in the air, something denser than the fog itself, and his eyes were fixed on that shadow, waiting for her to speak, to do anything. But she didn't move, didn't react. She just watched him, as if waiting for something. And what did she want? What did that being want from him? What more could he do in a place where time seemed to have stopped, where everything around him was wrapped in an endless nightmare? What was happening there was beyond Zhuang's comprehension. His brain was trying to process the impossible, but the pieces of the puzzle just didn't fit. The presence of the hooded figure, the dense fog, and the strange distortions in time and space seemed to defy everything he knew. Each moment felt more surreal than the last, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. He looked at the road ahead, but there were no more clues, nothing but the fog stretching endlessly. The fear consumed him, and he made an impulsive decision to run. If he could just get out of there, leave the truck and the figure behind, maybe he would find an escape, a place where the world still made sense. His feet hit the asphalt hard, and he started to run, but soon he realized that something wasn't right. It wasn't exhaustion or terror that slowed him down. There was something else, something invisible but palpable that kept him from moving forward. He tried harder, but his muscles were heavy, as if they were being pulled back by invisible chains. With every step he took, it felt like the truck was getting closer. The engine, which had once sounded distant, was now louder, more present, and the sound reverberated in his head, as if it were pressing in from all sides. He looked back and saw the figure, still motionless, but now the truck seemed closer than before, so close that he could almost touch it. Terror overtook his body, and a cold sensation ran down his spine. It was as if destiny itself were conspiring against him, as if the road had become a living organism, a force that pulled him back toward the truck, giving him no chance to escape. He tried to scream, to call for help, but his voice was muffled, as if the air around him was too dense to carry sound. He looked around, searching for an exit, but there was nowhere to run. The road was narrowing, the fog was growing thicker, and the hooded figure continued to watch him closely without moving. The truck, now so close that João could feel the vibration of the engine in the air, seemed like the only real thing in a world that was becoming increasingly distorted. And then, as if everything had frozen for a moment, he understood. He wasn't just trapped on that road. In that moment, he was trapped in something bigger, something beyond human understanding, a force that transcended reality. The truck, the figure, the fog, everything was interconnected, and he couldn't escape. He was destined to be there, in that place, at that time, with that figure watching him like a predator watches its prey. The road wasn't just a physical path, it was a trap, an invisible web that had ensnared him without him realizing it, until it was too late. With his heart racing, João realized that there was no choice left. He was no longer in control. His fate had already been sealed. And then he remembered the stories told at the rest stops, those whispered conversations between sips of coffee and the distant hum of engines. Experienced truckers, their faces marked by time and the road, would share tales that sounded more like legends than truths. Stories of deserted roads, of solitary journeys that ended in inexplicable ways. Some said the trucks would disappear along with the drivers, as if they were swallowed by the road itself, absorbed by the shadows and the fog that always seemed to haunt those more isolated routes. João had heard those stories many times. Most of the time, he dismissed them as mere superstition, fantasies created by the solitude and fatigue of truckers. But now, facing the vastness of that empty road, the fog surrounding him like a dense, suffocating cloak, he could not deny the chill running down his spine. He remembered the words of an old trucker, a man with many years on the road, who had told him that at night, roads could become more than just asphalt. They could transform into portals, into something alive, with a will of its own, that lured traveler to its depths. Those stories had always seemed too fantastical, but at that moment, he began to question his own perception of reality. The truck behind him, the hooded figure, the thick fog that swallowed everything. It all seemed to have come from a nightmare. What if those legends were more real than he had imagined? What if he were just another trucker doomed to disappear, swallowed by that stretch of road that, apparently, had never been meant to be found again? The sound of the engine behind him grew louder, and João felt as if he were being pulled into something bigger than himself, something he couldn't understand, but deeply felt. The hooded figure, motionless and silent, continued to watch him, its presence constant, as if it had always been there, waiting for. The road seemed alive, almost breathing, and João felt that there was no way to escape anymore. He was trapped, not only physically, but in a cycle that may have never ended. The stories he had heard at the rest stops, those tales of missing drivers, now carried a different one, a darker one. He understood what they meant, and the truth behind them made him shiver. The road, the fog, the truck. Perhaps he was destined to be just another one of those, another legend whispered by those who still traveled the deserted routes, warning each other of the invisible dangers that lurked in the shadows. João, already desperate, felt that something much more sinister was at play. He was no longer on an ordinary road, nor in a familiar place. The feeling of displacement overtook him completely, as if he were trapped in a dimension where time and space no longer made sense. The road ahead, which once seemed like an endless path, now appeared to twist, as if closing around him, a maze with no exit. He no longer knew what was real and what was not, the world around him dissolving into fragments, into shadows that danced under the thick fog. Desperate, he tried to scream, call for help, but his voice was swallowed by the wind, as if there was no longer enough air for him to be heard. The sound of his throat trying to make a cry was muffled, nullified by the invisible force surrounding him. He opened his mouth, tried to call out, but no sound came. He was silent, surrounded by a dense and oppressive emptiness. Each breath became harder, and his vision blurred, as if the very light was fading, leaving everything in an endless twilight. The fog, which had seemed like just a physical barrier, now felt alive, something that was watching him, consuming him. He felt as if he were being pulled into the heart of the fog, as if it were an entity of its own, a cosmic force that fed on him, on his hope, on his understanding. The road he thought he knew was now unrecognizable, an endless road, a distorted mirror of a place that belonged to no known world. And then, he saw her again. The hooded figure was in front of him, motionless, but now it seemed closer, as if it had emerged from the very air, from the fog that surrounded him. She watched him with a subtle smile, but somehow, it was a smile that carried an ancient wisdom, a dark certainty. The figure's gaze seemed not only to see him, but to penetrate his soul, as if she already knew exactly who he was. As if she knew, with chilling precision, the fate that awaited him. The smile of the hooded figure seemed to widen, an expression of triumph, as if she knew there was no turning back. Juwon tried to move his feet, to run, to scream, but his muscles were paralyzed, as if his body were being consumed by an invisible force. He could no longer escape, he could no longer resist. The road, the figure, the fog, everything became one entity, a force that absorbed him, and he couldn't escape. The last thing he saw, before disappearing completely, was that smile, a calm, almost consoling smile, as if she had been waiting for him all along, as if she knew that moment was inevitable. And then, everything went dark. The road, the fog, the figure, everything vanished into an absolute silence. Juwon was gone, and the road continued to stretch, endless, waiting for the next lost traveler, the next driver destined to disappear into the shadows, where time and space no longer make sense. The deserted roads continue to harbor the mystery of truckers who never return, their stories swallowed by the fog and silence. The rest stops, now empty and dark, echo with memories of whispered conversations about those who disappeared without a trace. Their trucks, just like them, vanished into the shadows of the road, as if swallowed by a force no one can understand. Time seems to fold on these forgotten routes, and those who venture upon them feel, in the thick air and the solitude that surrounds them, that something is always. For those who dare to cross these same routes, the fear of encountering something inexplicable on the way never fades. The feeling of being watched, of something bigger and older waiting at the next turn, remains like an invisible shadow that follows each mile. The noise of the engine, the headlight that gets lost in the fog, and even the deep silence of the night become inseparable companions on a journey full of tension and uncertainty. Every deserted road has its story, and on each one, a trucker perhaps got lost, swallowed by a fate they could never have predicted. Who knows? Perhaps the legends about these roads are not just stories. Perhaps they are warnings, fragments of a truth that no one dares to fully understand. Maybe, somewhere between the asphalt and the fog, the trucks and their drivers are still waiting for new travelers. Are they trapped in an eternal cycle, doomed to wander these routes, waiting for those who, like them, dare to challenge the unknown? The mystery continues to exist, like the endless road, always ready to swallow another curious soul, another traveler willing to face the darkness. And so, the legends live, persist, and perhaps are truer than anyone would dare to believe.
The headlights cut through the darkness of Interstate 40, but with each kilometer that Jack Turner advanced, the road seemed to swallow the truck, as if he were being pulled into an endless nightmare. The empty asphalt stretching out before him seemed infinite, a straight line disappearing into the blackness of the horizon, while the desert around him appeared to silently expand, watching him. The radio, which had been silent before, suddenly crackled. A deep, distorted sound, as though the device was struggling against an unknown force, filled the cabin. Jack, with sweaty fingers on the wheel, quickly glanced at the dashboard, trying to adjust the frequency but couldn't. Then, the voice came. Low, deep, and almost palpable, the voice whispered in the air, reverberating off the truck's metal walls. "You shouldn't be here." Jack froze. His eyes widened, and the steering wheel slipped from his fingers, but he kept control. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the road itself was speaking to him, or worse, as if the darkness were alive, aware of his presence, and eager for something more. He looked around, but there was nothing but the empty desert, and the white line of the road disappearing beneath the wheels. The voice didn't come from the radio. It didn't come from anywhere, really. It was as if the very earth, the air, everything around him, was trying to speak to him or warn him. Fear chilled his spine as he accelerated, feeling the road narrow, something invisible pulling him into the unknown. The sky was closed off, and the stars, even the most distant ones, seemed fixed, watching him. The wind, once gentle, now carried a constant whisper, as if an invisible crowd surrounded him. Jack looked into the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Still, he felt watched, as if the road were claiming him, as if the desert had already decided what would become of him. He felt deeply that whatever that voice was, it wasn't something he could simply ignore. Something much older and darker was lurking, waiting for him at the end of that endless road. Fear tightened his throat. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. Whatever was waiting on the horizon was not just a sandstorm. It was something far worse. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a strip of asphalt lost in the emptiness of the desert. The truck's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating only a few meters ahead, like a fragile lantern in the vastness of the night. With each kilometer, the landscape seemed to shift, the desert devouring everything around him. The hot, dry air pressed down on him, and the silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the constant hum of the engine and the whisper of the wind, which sounded more like a distant lament. Jack glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just emptiness. A thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything behind him, as if the road were disintegrating into nothingness. His gaze remained fixed on the mirror, searching for some reference, some change, but there was nothing but an unchanging, endless darkness. The radio, which had previously stitched the stillness of the night with a few static bursts, was now completely silent. There was no music, no news, no voices. The sound of the engine, with its monotonous hum, was the only thing filling the oppressive silence that surrounded him. Every acceleration seemed to take Jack further, deeper, on a journey without destination, as if time and space had been distorted by the vastness of the desert. With each kilometer, the truck seemed more alone, smaller in the face of that endless solitude. The headlights illuminated the road for brief moments, but soon it swallowed everything in front of him again, leaving him lost in the immensity of the night. Fear, a strange and almost indescribable sensation, began to take root in his chest. He didn't know whether it was the desert consuming him or if he was the one getting lost in the emptiness itself. He accelerated, trying to push the thought away. But the desert, silent and impassive, seemed unconcerned with his haste, and the road stretched endlessly ahead of him, waiting. Then something made him stop. Something in the corner of his eye, a quick movement almost imperceptible. Jack furrowed his brow, his instincts on alert, but whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Something inside him told him to keep going, but the warning was too strong. He slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding down the road with difficulty, the weight of the vehicle slowing down gradually over the hot, rough asphalt. Silence once again swallowed everything around him as the truck finally came to a stop. Jack remained still for a moment, the headlights casting light into the emptiness in front of him, the beam flickering, as if even it were uncomfortable with what had just happened. He looked to the side, then the other, scanning the endless desert around him. But there was nothing. No animals, no people, nothing but the vast, silent desert. The weak wind stirred small clouds of dust, but nothing more. He breathed deeply, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. He wiped his forehead, feeling the cold sweat running down his skin, as if the heat of the night were trying to burn the doubt in his mind. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, a sigh of frustration escaping his lips. It was just my mind. I'm overreacting, he thought, trying to convince himself. But despite his attempt to rationalize, a strange cold spread through his body. The road was empty. The desert was empty. But something, some movement, some unseen sign was still there, hidden in the shadows of his perception. He tried to ignore it. Tried to believe it was just the fatigue, the loneliness of the journey, the effect of the long, endless road. However, something inside him knew. Something wasn't right. But what could it be? Yet as he resumed driving, the feeling of being watched never left him. It was as if the very eyes of the desert were fixed on him, peering through the darkness, waiting for the right moment to act. The silence in the truck was oppressive, heavy, as if the air around him was compressed, squeezed by the vastness of the desert. It was a dense, uncomfortable silence, as if even the wind, which had previously whispered in his direction, now seemed to have been silenced by the very presence of that road. The desert didn't seem empty now. It seemed to be waiting, awaiting something. Jack tried to distract himself. He looked at the truck's dashboard, the buttons, the lights softly blinking, and even tried to sing quietly. But the words died in his throat. His gaze flickered from side to side, trying to find something to focus on, anything that would take his mind off the growing weight that seemed to settle within him. But nothing worked. His thoughts began to spiral, twisting into a dark place where the discomfort seemed to grow. The road continued before him, an endless strip of asphalt fading into the horizon. But now, each kilometer felt more like a warning, more confirmation that he was being led to a destination he didn't understand. The feeling that the road wasn't guiding him to somewhere, but to a specific place, and perhaps a dangerous one, began to grow, like a shadow stretching ominously. It was as if he was no longer in control, as if the road, the desert, and even the wind that now sliced through the air, almost imperceptibly, had something to say, something he couldn't understand, but felt with every fiber of his being. The truck felt slower, the engine heavier, and the sensation of being pulled towards something beyond his comprehension grew stronger with every passing moment. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, as if that could push away the pressure in his chest. But there was nothing he could do. The road continued ahead, impassive, like an invitation to an uncertain and unsettling fate. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain: the desert had something to reveal, and he was getting closer to discovering what. A fate he couldn't comprehend. The radio suddenly crackled, breaking the absolute silence that surrounded him. Jack froze, his eyes fixed on the device as if it were a living entity, something more than mere technology, something with a threatening presence. The crackle was followed by static, a vibration in the air, and then a voice. But it wasn't an ordinary voice. It was distorted, drawn out, as if someone was trying to speak through an unknown tongue, something that merged with the very noise of the night. "Turn back. Don't go forward. You're lost." The words pierced his brain like sharp blades. Jack felt his blood freeze in his veins. He tried to react, pressing the radio button, but the voice persisted, as if it was coming from within the truck itself, from within the very road. "Turn back. Don't go forward. You're lost." The voice seemed to emanate from a distant place, but at the same time, it was incredibly close, almost as if it were his own consciousness trying to scream in his mind. The message was clear, but the sense that this was not an ordinary warning was indistinct. It wasn't a human voice. There was no emotion in it, only raw, cold, and threatening force, dragging the words as if they were crumbling under the weight of an unbearable truth. Jack looked at the truck's dashboard, his fingers trembling, but the radio wouldn't turn off. He forced his eyes away from the device, but the fear had already begun to spread throughout his body. Whatever that voice was, it knew more than it should. It knew what he was doing, knew where he was going. He felt the weight of the desert, of the road, as if everything were compressing against him, as if the very path itself were becoming a nightmare. "Turn back," the voice insisted, weaker now, like a distant whisper. Jack gritted his teeth, took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't turn back. Something inside him, a part of his being, was compelled to continue, as if the destiny had already been set. He pressed the accelerator, the truck moving more forcefully along the deserted road. But the voice didn't leave him. It echoed in his mind like an endless reverberation, a warning he could no longer ignore. He didn't know what awaited him ahead, but something inside him already knew. He was approaching something far greater than any fear or explanation, something he couldn't comprehend, but that he was about to encounter. Jack swallowed hard. It was impossible, he thought. He was alone there, in the vast desert, in the oppressive silence of the night. But the voice felt so real, so full of a threat he could hardly process. His heart beat erratically, sweat running down his forehead as he stared fixedly at the radio. Logic tried to take over, telling him it was just a transmission malfunction, something the exhaustion was distorting in his mind. But the voice, that voice, was so vivid, so full of an unknown power, that he couldn't just ignore it. He tried fiddling with the radio, his trembling hands trying to tune into any frequency, any signal that might bring some semblance of normalcy back, but there was no signal. The device was completely silent, except for the voice, still resonating in the back of his mind. It didn't come from anywhere, and yet it was everywhere. A barely audible whisper, but it filled every corner of the truck with a sense of imminent danger. "Turn back. Don't go forward. You're lost." The phrase, now repeated for the umpteenth time, seemed to echo inside his head, more distorted, more distant, as if the voice were trying to reach something beyond its grasp, something he couldn't comprehend. With every repetition, the threat became more palpable, more urgent, as if the very air around him were growing thicker, denser. Jack pressed the radio button harder, desperately trying to stop the sound. But nothing. He was trapped, listening to that voice, each word dragging as if it were a sentence, a condemnation. He looked at the road ahead, the headlights casting long shadows, illuminating the emptiness, the darkness swallowing everything. There was nothing there, nothing but the silent desert. What was that? Why that voice? What did it want from him? Fear now spread through his body like poison, and the control he thought he had over the situation slipped away. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. But in that moment, the feeling of being watched was so strong that he could no longer be sure of anything. The road before him seemed to stretch endlessly, as if time weren't passing, as if he were trapped in an endless cycle. And the voice, growing weaker but still there, wouldn't let him forget. "Turn back. You're lost." It was as if he were being dragged towards something he couldn't see, but knew was lurking, waiting, getting closer and closer. He turned off the radio, but the feeling of discomfort didn't fade. The sound of static that had filled the space was replaced by an even deeper silence, as if the very air around him were watching him. Jack looked at the dashboard, trying to focus his mind on anything else, but the cold chill down his spine remained, constant, threatening. He glanced to the side, hoping to find something familiar, something that would anchor him to the deserted road. But the scene remained the same. The road was empty, unchanging, stretching endlessly before him. No life in sight, just the desert, immense and silent, like an endless sea of sand and darkness. But then, something caught his attention. To his left, in the dimness of the darkness, something moved. Jack blinked, trying to focus his eyes, but the movement was so quick, so fleeting, that he almost doubted himself. He squinted, trying to make out what it was, but it was useless. In an instant, it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, like a shadow dissolving into the night. Jack's heart raced. What was that? He looked around again, once more, hoping to find some rational explanation. But nothing. The desert was empty, the road even longer, more solitary. His breathing quickened, and he felt a strange tension spread through his body. An illusion, he thought, trying to convince himself. Something caused by his tired mind, the solitude of the road. But the doubt had already been planted, and the feeling that it hadn't just been a trick of perception took root in his chest. What if it wasn't an illusion? What if, in fact, something was there, watching him, waiting? He swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down his spine. Whatever it was moving in the desert beside him, something he couldn't see, but that he felt more and more present. The road ahead of him now seemed more threatening, heavier, as if it were closing in around him. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on what really mattered, moving forward. But the unease, the feeling that something was approaching, something he couldn't comprehend, wouldn't let him be at peace. Whatever it was, in the darkness he knew, it wasn't just an illusion. Something more was lurking, and he was no longer alone. Suddenly he noticed something even stranger. The shadow moving along the edge of the road didn't seem to be there by chance. There was something peculiar about it, as if it had an intention, a direction of its own. It seemed human, or almost. Jack blinked, incredulous, trying to process what his eyes were telling him. He squinted, trying to distinguish more details, but the figure was hard to identify. It was an indistinct shadow, a silhouette that moved fluidly, as if made of darkness itself. It had no exact shape, but there was something deeply human in the way it moved, as if it were following each movement of the truck, as if it were aware of his presence. He looked again, more attentively, forcing himself to understand what he was seeing, but before he could process the sight, the shadow disappeared, swallowed by the deep darkness of the desert. It vanished without leaving a trace, without making a sound, as if it had never existed. The silence returned, heavy and dense, but now he could no longer shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching him. Jack forced himself to look ahead, keeping his eyes fixed on the road before him, the headlights illuminating only a stretch of the darkness. He tried not to think about what he had just seen, but the image of the shadow lingered, floating in his mind like an echo. The fear began to spread, tightening his chest, making it harder to breathe. He knew he should keep going. He knew he needed to move forward, not stop. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, as if the very road itself were alive, watching his movements, waiting for the right moment to reveal something more. Something he couldn't understand, but that he felt was getting closer and closer. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, but now Jack felt he wasn't alone in those vast, deserted distances. Something was following him, something invisible and threatening, and he didn't know if he was being hunted or if he was already being slowly consumed by the road itself. The truck seemed to be getting heavier, harder to control, as if it were being pulled by something invisible. The engine rumbled with more effort, and the steering wheel trembled in his hands, as if the vehicle were resisting, as if something beyond his own strength were trying to hold him back. Each kilometer seemed slower, denser, as if the road was stretching, halting his movement, making it impossible to escape. The silence now was absolute, an oppressive stillness that made the sound of his irregular breathing seem like the only noise in the world. The hot, dry air enveloped the cabin, and Jack felt his body tense, as if it were a rope about to snap. He quickly glanced at the dashboard, as if some button could fix the course, but nothing changed. Only the road ahead, dark and endless. It was then that he looked into the rearview mirror, as if that could bring some answer, some reassurance. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that the weight of the truck was just the accumulated fatigue of the road, the pressure of the endless night. But when he looked into the reflection, something made him freeze. In the glass, a figure stood out from the shadows. Behind him, an indistinct silhouette, but impossible to ignore. It had no clear shape, no details, but its presence was undeniable. Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He couldn't see the face, couldn't identify anything but the shadow cast by the darkness, but the feeling was unbearable. It was as if someone was there, but not fully revealing themselves, as if the eyes of that figure were fixed on him, burning through the rearview mirror, piercing the darkness of the night and the safety of the cabin. The figure wasn't running. There was no hurry. It didn't move with the agility of someone chasing him, but with the calmness of something that knew exactly where it wanted to be, something that didn't need to rush. It simply followed him, every kilometer, every meter of the road, as if it were always behind him, waiting for the right moment to move forward. Fear took root in his chest. Jack tried to accelerate, but the truck felt even heavier, as if the road, the desert, and that invisible presence were conspiring against him. The unyielding gaze of the figure, invisible but undeniable, intensified the feeling that he was no longer alone, and the road ahead of him, which had once seemed like a path to follow, now felt like a trap, a prison of sand and darkness. He tried to focus on what was ahead, trying to push the image of the rearview mirror from his mind, but the silhouette still burned in his thoughts. No matter what he did, he felt like he was being followed, hunted, and that there was no turning back. He accelerated, trying to push away the panic, trying to escape the shadow of that inexplicable presence. But the figure also accelerated, as if it were in perfect sync with him, moving with a terrifying precision, as if it knew exactly when he would try to escape. It couldn't be real, Jack thought, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. He forced his eyes to focus on the road ahead, trying to concentrate on the direction, trying to rationalize what was happening. With every turn, with every kilometer, the figure seemed to draw closer, closer to his reflection, closer to him. It was as if the darkness of the night had taken shape, a shape that should not exist. But then, the truck made a strange noise, a sharp thud, like a dull thump against the body, as if something had collided with the vehicle. Jack flinched, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly looked at the mirrors but saw nothing. Nothing but the deep darkness of the desert, the vast emptiness stretching around him. The headlights illuminated only the void ahead, casting distorted shadows on the road, as if the darkness itself had begun to move, to transform. He looked outside, his mind trying to understand what had happened. There was no sign of life, nothing but sand and darkness. But the feeling that something was there, right beside him, didn't fade. The sound of the engine seemed farther away now, and the truck was harder to control. Every movement of the steering wheel was met with resistance, as if something invisible were holding the vehicle back, preventing it from continuing its path. He was losing control. The steering wheel seemed to slip from his hands, and the truck, in response, swerved, the direction becoming more and more erratic. Jack tried to correct it, but the truck was out of his control, as if the road itself was turning into a nightmare, with reality distorting every second. The engine roared, but weakly, as if it were dying. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. It kept sliding down the road, as if it were being pulled toward a destination beyond his control. Fear enveloped him, tightening his chest. But the worst part wasn't the imminent danger. It was the feeling that something was watching him, something was there in the darkness, waiting. The figure. He knew he wasn't alone on those roads anymore, no longer in control. He didn't know what it was, but something inside him told him the road wouldn't lead to somewhere safe. It was only drawing him closer to something he couldn't escape. The voice on the radio returned, louder, clearer, more threatening. Every word seemed to pierce the silence of the night like a sharp blade, echoing in his mind with an almost unbearable intensity. You can't escape. A chill ran down his spine, a cold wave spreading throughout his body. Jack felt his muscles stiffen, and for a moment he almost stopped breathing, as if the air had become denser, heavier. He no longer knew if he was awake. The feeling of being trapped between sleep and wakefulness, between the real and the unreal, was becoming unbearable. He looked out the window, trying to anchor himself in reality, trying to find something familiar, something that would pull him from this nightmare. But, like in a nightmare, what he saw was even more disturbing. The silhouette, the same figure that had been following him in the darkness. It was there, closer now, more real. Every step it took seemed to drag the darkness around it, as if it were part of it, as if the night itself were taking shape. And then, the figure began to move. It didn't walk, didn't use its feet. Its body was twisted, contorted in an unnatural way, as if it were dragging itself, crawling toward him. The movements were slow, almost excruciating, but relentless, as if it was determined not to let Jack escape. The sight of it made his heart race faster, a visceral terror coursing through his veins. Jack could no longer breathe, his chest tight, his mind spinning in a whirlpool of panic and confusion. He tried to look at the road ahead, but his eyes kept returning to the rearview mirror, to the silhouette that was now only a few meters away, crawling in his direction, with visible agony in every twisted movement. Was he going crazy? Or was this real? The doubt tore at his mind. The line between what he believed was possible and what he was seeing was beginning to vanish. Reality was crumbling around him, and he no longer knew if he was being hunted by something beyond his understanding, or if his mind was finally cracking under the pressure of loneliness, fear, and the endless road. The figure, now almost completely at his door, paused for a moment. Jack felt as though the air had disappeared, as if time had frozen. And then, slowly and almost deliberately, it lifted its head. The eyes were not visible, but he felt, with an overwhelming intensity, that they were fixed on him, burning through the glass. He couldn't move. Whatever it was, he knew there was no escape anymore. The road was leading him to that inevitable encounter, to that final moment, and he couldn't stop. He couldn't run. He screamed, a burst of terror that seemed to echo against the truck's cabin, and then he floored the vehicle with all the force his trembling hands could apply. But no matter how hard he drove, no matter how much he tried to escape, the figure was there, always there, like an unrelenting shadow, closer with every second. Now, it was on the windshield, banging against the glass with supernatural force, a horrible, dragged, inhuman sound, as if something were trying to get in, trying to devour him. The sound made his body freeze, each thump a direct blow to his sanity, as if reality were falling apart in pieces with every impact. The truck swerved uncontrollably, the engine roaring, sputtering, as if it were being dragged somewhere he couldn't see. The headlights flickered, illuminating the darkness with irregular flashes, casting grotesque shadow plays on the road ahead. But the road now seemed to twist, to contort, distorting as though it were made of something pliable, something that no longer obeyed the rules he knew. Every turn felt tighter, every kilometer seemed to stretch indefinitely as he moved forward, but something was changing. Something was wrong. Jack desperately looked around, trying to find some reference point, something to anchor him in reality, but the darkness around him was total, impenetrable. He no longer knew where he was. He couldn't tell where the road ended and where the abyss began. The horizon vanished, and the line that separated the ground from the sky was now a blur, a patch of immense darkness surrounding him on all sides. What was he chasing? What was hunting him? Or perhaps leading him toward something he couldn't understand? The figure on the glass, now even closer, seemed to be smiling, stretching into a misshapen contour, an overwhelming presence that filled him with paralyzing fear. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something real, something that was waiting for him. And with every passing second, he felt he was closer to discovering what was really behind him, and what would happen when it finally caught up with him. He could no longer think, the ideas clashing, the fear blinding his reasoning. The road he had been trying to travel now seemed like a trap, and he was being led into it, like an insect drawn to an invisible web. Whatever was out there, he now knew for sure. There was no escape. He was no longer in control. And perhaps, at that moment, he wasn't the hunter anymore. Perhaps it was him, Jack Turner, who was being hunted. And the voice never stopped. Every word seemed to scratch at his soul, an inescapable presence that chased him every millisecond. There was no escape. There was no escape. The voice came from the radio, but it also came from the road itself, from the very air around him, as if it were embedded in every grain of sand in the desert, in every piece of darkness. Go back. You already know what you did. You won't make it. It was impossible to ignore. Each syllable pulsed in his mind, a growing threat that sank deeper with every repetition, every distorted phrase. The pressure increased, overwhelming. He wanted to scream, wanted to break the radio, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed, as if the voice had embedded itself in his mind, becoming a part of him. Suddenly, without warning, the truck's headlights went out. The light that had cut through the darkness was gone, leaving only absolute darkness. The truck continued to slide, aimless, out of control, as if it had lost its reason for existing. The sound of the engine vanished, as if the engine itself were being swallowed by the emptiness around. The silence was total. There was nothing more, neither the sound of the road under the tires, nor the wind that had once caressed the metal. Nothing, only the immense, crushing darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything anymore. Time seemed to have stopped. He was lost, more lost than he could have ever imagined. And then one final laugh, low, distorted, a horrible sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was a laugh that froze Jack's blood, a laugh full of mockery, as if it knew the end before it even happened. The sound reverberated in the darkness, echoing along the road he would never see again, breaking the silence with its dark presence. Jack was no longer on the road. He had never been. The reality he knew had disappeared, dissolved in the darkness, in a place where there were no more boundaries, where time did not exist. He was trapped in something beyond what he could comprehend, in a space where the road was only an illusion, where he was just a lost shadow, following a path that led nowhere. And then, like the road that vanishes into the night, Jack also disappeared, merged with the darkness, leaving no trace, never having existed.